Hi, I'm Julie Ross,
And I'm Elizabeth Cohen.
and this is the Parenting Horizons podcast.
Julie Ross is a parent educator and counselor with over 30 years of experience in private practice.
Elizabeth is a clinical psychologist with over 20 years of experience in private practice.
Perhaps most importantly, we're parents just like you.
Through conversations covering a wide range of different parenting topics, challenges, and roadblocks, we hope to give you some practical tools that might just help make parenting a little bit easier.
Nobody's perfect, and parenting is challenging, to say the least. But with a few skills under our belts, we might just be able to be good enough parents and enjoy the journey and our children a little bit more in the process.
Hello, and welcome back to the Parenting Horizons podcast. I'm Julie Ross, and I am here again with my co-host, Elizabeth Cohen. We have a guest with us tonight. I'm very excited about this topic and this guest in particular. Her name is Val Marsden Fitzhugh, and I'm going to let her introduce herself to you guys because she knows her bio far better than I do. So, Val, what would you like to say to kind of just tell our listeners who you are?
Sure. Well, thanks, Julie, and thanks, Elizabeth, for welcoming tonight. This is very exciting. Yeah, my name is Val, and I'm the founder of Next Level Learning. We're a New York City-based learning center that has supported, thousands of students for about the last 25 years in academic skills, learning skills, especially including executive functioning, standardized test prep, and admissions processes for middle, high schools, and colleges. I think one thing that's a little different about us is that we have very personalized work with our students, tailoring a plan for each and every one, keeping in mind their learning style first and foremost. We also partner with parents and neuropsychologists to help carry out recommendations, for example, from an evaluation. And we have a good relationship with our students' teachers as well. We want to make sure that whatever methods we're teaching our kids, that we're supporting theirs as well. So thanks
Yes,
again for including me. I'm looking
me
forward to this
too. I
conversation.
think parents hear a lot about executive functioning. They hear a lot about it, being an issue. My first question to you, Val, is how would a parent know that their child has an executive functioning issue? How does it manifest in the house? And then after you answer that, and I'll probably ask this again, but after you answer that, my question is, what is executive functioning? Kind of why is it important? So if you don't mind just starting with like, how does a parent pick up on something like this?
Sure. I think with students, you can sometimes see issues, with organization, turning in assignments on time, maybe some, dysregulation with moods. But with executive functioning, I think what it can come down to is the duration, the frequency and the duration of what you're seeing at home. So, for example, it might be ongoing, depression or frustration. Difficulties with regulating emotions. So I think if parents can ask themselves how long their children have exhibited these signs, they might get a sense if it's something that goes a little bit beyond just typical childhood and adolescent development. In our students, we can see issues with social emotional regulation, a lot of disorganization, um, difficulties with planning tasks, budgeting time, executing the tasks, submitting the work, which is really
Right.
frustrating, especially if the student has done their work and then they just don't, they
Yeah.
just don't hand it in. So maybe a parent might see that their child is lacking systems to help them plan and organize, and also tools for, I think, being accountable
Mhm.
to themselves by standing up to themselves, asking a teacher for support, owning up if they've missed something, and then asking themselves, what can I do better,
Mhm.
next time? So that's what we see a lot in our students, that seems to go just beyond typical,
Right.
developmental
And you
stages.
said something, I think, about like moodiness. Is that part of it, or did I mishear that? Or
No, I've seen that in a lot of our students, and also just among my parent group as well, where their children can be struggling with emotional regulation. I will say, I think COVID had a lot to do with it. When students were disconnected from real live interactions with their teachers and their peers for so long, it
Sure.
really impacted them. And I've seen in a lot of my, I won't say my kid, although I have, but my friends' kids, and also from, being on the board at my son's middle school and now high school and talking closely with administration there, we've seen these issues going on far longer than is typically, normal, with students sort of being a bit behind the curve, not just academically, but in terms of their, social
Right.
emotional skills.
Yeah. I think that COVID really impacted kids' abilities to learn executive functioning skills that are taught in school. So even the kids who might not have naturally, organically, genetically executive functioning problems, many kids didn't learn the tools. And that's what I've seen in my practice. And I'm glad you brought up the emotion regulation as well. And I wanted to circle back to Julie's question about how do you know if your kid has executive functioning? It's making me smile because I have two kids who have executive functioning struggles. And I remember with my oldest, I didn't realize that it didn't take every kid like 20 minutes to get their
Mm.
shoes on in the morning until he had a sleepover and his friend did not took about 4
Wow.
seconds to put his shoes on. And so I just want to say to parents that it can be hard when you have an N of 1
Yeah.
or an N of 2, right? You only have your family, and because a lot of this is genetic, you might be like this or your partner might be like not like this. So it's really important to I think it's such an important topic that we're talking about because it can be really
Yeah.
hard to discern, Julie, I think. And Val, I assume you'd
And is
agree
it
with that.
is it I'm going to use a fancy word, comorbid with other things. So for our listeners, what that means is, do we see this as a kind of bundle with things like being on the spectrum, things like ADHD, things like depression or anxiety? I mean, is it bundled or is it really a separate entity?
I've seen it bundled, especially with ADHD. I find that a lot of challenges with that and executive functioning are pretty closely related, especially like with an
Mm,
inattentive type. So, difficulty, focusing on a task, sustaining attention, that's a big one. Organizing those tasks, and also, like I said before, but executing them, completing those assignments. So, I think they are
okay,
closely
yeah.
related.
And do you find that the work that one would do with someone, let's say with ADHD, is going to be substantially different from executive function coaching, or are there or is there a need for both, let's say?
I think with our students, we tend to do sort of a hybrid approach, focusing on the
Mhm.
commonalities with coaching. So if you want me to go just a little bit into that, like, would it help to talk about
I
what a
think
coaching
I think that would
session
be
would look like with a
awesome. I think
student?
that would be really helpful.
Sure. Well, I think one thing, just to preface it, is to for us all to remember, whether you have an elementary school student or a high school student, is how much information these kids have to track these days. When you think about maybe just on your computer alone, all of the tabs that you have open on your window. So imagine for a kid, their teacher might use Google Classroom, another teacher might use a different platform. Some teachers don't use that at all, and they might hand out
Yes.
paper assignments, and then just grade tracking. Teachers have
Mhm.
different systems. There's so much information out there to keep track of. And then in terms of tracking, do you prefer a physical planner? Do you use a Google Calendar? Do you set alerts in your phone? I just find that my head alone is cluttered with everything that I look at and face every single day. I can't imagine what it's like for a kid who's just learning to implement skills and sort through this whole
Right.
mess to figure out what is it that works best for them. So a lot of our coaching with students is showing them these different systems and trying to figure out what resonates with them most. One thing that
Mhm.
works for you, might not work for me or Elizabeth. So a lot of a session with a student is our planning work beforehand is we like to log into their Google Classroom, for example, with the parent's permission, of course, just to see what they have coming up. And then when we're working with a student, even though we know what they have going on, we have them share their screen, log in, and have them tell us what the priorities are. Because I'm always curious just to see, are they in alignment? And then we
Mm,
start making a plan for the week. The one goal is to try to avoid
right.
cramming, the night before, but to look at
Yeah.
everything coming up and then track it in a way that makes sense for them. Like I said, I'm old school, like old and old. Went
Me
to
too.
school a long time ago, but I like pencil to paper. I use a planner. But kids, might prefer like those digital alerts, for example, but we go through and we try to plan, what the week looks like. I think it's also important to encourage them to come up with their own goals and their own attentions. So rather me say, how about trying this, have them look at it and say, well, what do you think are the priorities are? What do you think that you could do this week that maybe you didn't try last week? Like, for example, we see a lot of students who struggle with speaking
Hmm.
up in class. So simply writing down a question or two so that when you
Mm,
raise your hand, you've
right.
rehearsed your script in a way. Just that
Mm,
little tweak can help make a difference.
Yeah.
For any student who might struggle with impulsivity and talk a lot out of turn in class, it could really just be writing down two questions and saying, limit it to these two questions. Another intention could be, I plan to speak to my teacher before class and ask if I'm on track with this assignment or if there's anything else that I can, do to prepare. Finally, one good tip that I like to do with my son and also to myself is, instead of saying, yeah, I hear what you're saying, but I'll get to that later. If there's anything concrete that can be done in just less than 2 minutes, do it now
mm,
and get it over
Mm.
with. I find that my task list tends to get way too long if I write everything down. And if I can bang it out quickly, it's just better to do it then. And I guess the last thing is whatever is working for the student, have them try to explain why. What is it that they did? What was their
mm,
process that made it work?
mm.
And if it didn't, then what could they do differently,
Sure.
next time?
What I love about your process, Val, is that executive functioning entails a difficulty in planning. I always like to talk about it as like the CEO of your brain. Imagine that, you're a CEO and the CEO really doesn't do a ton of work. They really delegate, right? And they make big kind of decisions, but they delegate, they decide what is, as you said, priorities, right? It's a lot of balancing. And when we struggle with that, we don't know, where to prioritize and where to put our attention. And a lot of parents that I meet in my practice think that when they meet with an executive functioning coach, they're going to get tools and strategies. And I think that is important and you need to do that. But what I hear you saying is this second layer. So you give the tools and strategies, but you're also modeling such an important function that is missing in executive functioning, which is asking yourself, having interoceptive questions. What works for me? What doesn't work for me? What did work? How will today me feel and how will tomorrow me feel? Like that modeling is so important to do on top of the tools. And I think that that's the piece that often I think people miss, that they think it's just like a really good planner or a really good system for studying, but it's this interactive work that you do with kids that I've seen that really helps change, neural plasticity. Because I think to Julie's point earlier, my experience with clients in my practice is that lots of kids struggle with executive functioning struggles. The ones who can take the tools and kind of go with them and kind of integrate them quickly are less likely to be the ones who have underlying ADHD or
Mm.
other mood issues. So I think we kind of all need, I mean, I think there should be, and Val, maybe you want to speak to this, like executive functioning classes in school,
Right.
period, for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then the kids who kind of need more and more of the repetition, I think, are the ones who struggle with the underlying comorbidity. That's been my experience. So curious about your thoughts.
I hear what you're saying, and I was giggling before because I used to work for a CEO, and he really did not do that much. I was his planner.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, but I get it. It's so fascinating working with students and trying to figure out, not just for me to think what's the best system for them, but to also try to lead them to it so they can take more ownership of it. Because it's not going to help if I assess the situation and say, all right, I see what's going to help you if you do X, Y, and Z. They're the ones who have to. It's like leading the horse to water, right? Or no,
Hmm.
teaching someone to fish. You've got to
Yeah.
encourage them to come up with it on their own, because then they take ownership of it. And in the end, I think all we want our kids and students to do is to become more independent, confident learners. And if they know, like what tools work for them, they're going to be more likely to use
Sure.
them.
Absolutely. And as a parent who's had these kinds of supports for their kids, it is very difficult as a parent. Maybe I'm just speaking for myself, Julie. I wonder what you think. To not tell your children to use the tools you have. Like, it is just hard for me as a parent to be more curious, more open, more willing with my
Mhm.
kids. It's just harder.
Yes, I mean, I think I'm reminded of a long time ago when my son was struggling with some disorganization. I'm reminded of something that really made a profound impact on me, which was that in elementary school, kids are taught methods of organization. So they come in, they take their, little papers out of their backpack, they put them in their assigned cubby, they hang up their backpack in the little, room for the backpacks. Then they go and sit at their desk. So they're given these tools, let's say, but those tools don't work for everybody, right? It's okay when they're little and they're just, routinized. But what happens, like you said, Val, I was astonished. I'm quite a bit older. I was astonished that, back when I was in school, we had textbooks, bound things. All the papers were bound. You brought the bound thing home. And when my daughter and son respectively were growing up, it was all loose papers, and you have to have a trapper keeper binder, but that didn't work for my son. My daughter was fine with that, but it didn't work. And I think what I'm hearing you say is that executive functioning coaching, and especially the way you do it, looks at the individual child, and maybe you say to yourself, is this a visual child? Is this an auditory child? Is this a child who needs manipulatives? And then you figure out what kind of a system is going to work for that type of learner. Am I on target?
Hmm. Absolutely. I mean, because everyone is different. I don't know if this is related, but I'll never forget when we toured our son's elementary school. And some of the parents in our tour group, I think, were a little put off because when they saw this particular classroom, they didn't see neat
Right.
desks, in a row. What they saw was, clusters of desks. They saw pillows and cushions off to the side. And we were told, okay, this is independent reading time. And there were some kids sitting in their desks reading. And then there were a few kids sprawled out on pillows or tucked into little nooks reading while on their backs. And I think I heard a few parents in our group mutter, that's great. They look really comfortable and engaged. And others were muttering, wait a minute, why aren't they all
Yes.
doing it the same way? But I'll never forget that you bring up a great point, Julie, which is that not every system, works the same for
Yeah.
every kid.
Yeah. And it's making me think one of the most profound helps, executive functioning helps that I've seen for my daughter, but also for clients in my practice, is having
Mm.
someone with them to do the work, to witness them. And I wonder also if this is somewhat COVID related and all that isolation, but just having someone sit and say, hey, what do you think of this word? And what do you think of that word? And I think as parents, that that could be your role. There might be some families where that's possible, but I think we have to be realistic from economic requirements. Some people aren't home when their
Right.
kids are doing homework. Some people have their own stressors, might not English might be a second language, that it's can be really helpful to have another person there who is just simply witnessing you. Like that, I don't know if that comes up a lot for you, Val, in your sessions, but I've seen that with some of my clients.
It's a great question. It does come up a lot, and I think it sometimes can be better with a coach, with an expert like you, for example, who's not the parent looking at them in frustration, saying, "Oh, why didn't you do this? All you need to do is this." If you can have someone who's almost like an expert cheerleader in a way, kind of on the side, encouraging you, validating you when you see something that works. Um, Hearing you when you get frustrated, maybe, like I said, suggesting something else, but letting them take these different tools that you're showing them, try them out and see what works or what doesn't. My mom was a musician, especially a piano teacher, and she had to hire a different teacher for
Right.
my sister and me because we absolutely would not work for her. And I wonder if both of you can relate, but to those
Of course.
battles
Of
between parent
course.
and
Yes.
child, right? And I think sometimes working with an outside person, whether it's a mentor at school, an executive functioning coach can
Mhm.
really help the child be more open, be more
Right.
receptive to taking
Yeah.
in,
Mm.
that feedback, that support.
Have you been successful? I'm curious. You mentioned that you work sometimes with teachers, and I'm sitting here thinking to myself, the teacher, has a different role, right? They have 30, and some New York City public schools, 35 kids. And
Yes.
so a system is very important for them. And so I'm curious the response you've gotten, or any suggestions for parents, even to help advocate for their kids if they notice that due to their executive functioning they have
Mm.
some different needs, and how talking to teachers has gone and what you would recommend for parents.
Sure. I think talking to teachers, it can be a little bit of a mixed bag because some teachers, frankly, I think they've had their own model, which they've tested and can work for many, many students. And I think maybe perceiving, oh, I might need, extra support from a tutor or a coach. Like, I want to stick with my model and I want that person to support it. And we always try to do that, when we speak with whether it's neuropsychs or teachers about how can we best support the way that you're teaching. However, we
Mm,
also know that that may not work for every single student. And to your point, Elizabeth, how can you it's impossible to get to know
Yeah.
35 students intimately, each individual learning style. So
mhm,
in our work, we really try to identify that. And like you were saying earlier, Julie,
Hmm.
about like an auditory learner, a visual learner, try to figure out what it is that works best for them. In terms of I think you were asking, Elizabeth, about maybe parents getting involved, or is it about how parents can support that at home?
yeah. Well, I'm curious about both of those things. I'm curious about how parents can support kids with their executive functioning at home for sure. And then also if you just had any tips for reaching out to teachers. Of course, every teacher is different, but I'm thinking to parents, I always like to say, reach out, try. If a child is doing better in their classroom because their specific needs are being addressed, that works for the teacher. Like
Hmm.
that is actually a success for the teacher. And so if you have some information that might be able to help them, to partner with them. But I do think a lot of people are, and Julie, I don't know if you see this, but are kind of hesitant to reach out to the teachers as collaborators. It's either not reach out or kind of come in as the expert and
Oh,
authority. Do you see
yeah, of
that, Julie,
course. I,
sometimes
I
too?
think there's an embarrassment factor.
Yeah.
My kid isn't doing what quote unquote they should do or how I envision them doing. One of the things that I hear a lot from parents is, well, I don't want the school to label my child. And it's
Yeah.
just so heartbreaking to me because I feel like that can happen. I want to validate for some parents that can happen. Their kid can be pigeonholed into the one who can't pay any attention at all in class, gets sent to the principal all the time. It can, but it's less likely than the majority of the scenarios that I see, which is that teachers really want to be helpful for the students. I mean, it's their job, right, to educate these young people. And so the more information they have, I think, the better it is. Now, having said that, that requires the parents to understand their child. And what I find is that parents have a very rigid idea of how a child should do homework, when a child should do homework, et cetera, et cetera. So in my household, I'm a very social learner. I needed to do my homework at the dining room table. I needed to be in the midst of everything. It did not distract me. It kept me focused for some reason. So I'm a social learner. Some of these kids are sit at the desk learners. That was my son. My son needed to go into their room, sit at their desk, and do their homework there. My daughter needed to go into her room, sit at her desk, and listen to Broadway show tunes. I kid you not. And so I hear parents saying, "Well, yes, but my son or my daughter is lying in their bed, as you described, Val, like, in this little pocket with their
Mhm.
computer, and that's not right." But it's right if, the proof is in the pudding. If they're doing okay in school with that way of approaching homework and home study, then it's fine. There's nothing broken, right? So I think often parents really don't accept who their child is and what kind of a learner that their child is. And so that puts yet another stumbling block between them and the teacher
Yes,
and becoming a team.
I think that's right. You mentioned fear of being labeled, and then also, you know, not knowing them in that way. So when my son was diagnosed with ADHD, I remember telling his principal at the time, and she said to me, "We don't like labels here." And I
Oh dear.
said to her, "Well, you know what? Yeah." I said, "You picked the wrong person, sister," but I didn't say that part. But I said, I prefer the label ADHD to the other labels he's gotten here, which is lazy,
Oh,
bad, inappropriate, can't
Good for
keep his
you.
hands to himself. So he has labels already, and this is the appropriate label. And I think that defining the problem is always the first step to a solution. And again, we don't even have to define it as a problem. It's neurodivergence, like that's an old way of thinking about it as a problem. It's a different way of learning. And so I just really want to encourage parents that we could push back
Yeah.
against labels, and that
Yeah,
the
I
value
agree.
in them too. So,
Yeah. I know a kid who was I was called in to observe in the classroom because the kid was basically, instead of like walking up to the pencil sharpener to sharpen a pencil, the kid would dance up to the pencil sharpener, twirl and leap. And
I love it.
I went, and the school was labeling that as problematic behavior. And I said, "That's not problematic behavior." I said, "That's a future dancer." And sure enough, the kid is now a professional ballet dancer. So they removed him from that school
Amazing.
and put him in a school that was more open to different ways of walking to the pencil sharpener, right? So I think it's
Wow.
kind of one of the things that I ask parents to try to do, which is look at your child as a whole person, not as a future Wall Street executive, not as a future basketball coach, not as a future anything, right? But just as a person, and
Hmm.
try to discern what are the individual strengths, because we can build on strengths. And I think that's what you were saying, Val, earlier, which is that you ask the kids or the parents, what have you done in the past that's worked, right? Those are the strengths. We move forward and we can build on those strengths, I feel like, with kids. I am curious. I want to give you plenty more time, so I'm not trying to rush through, but I do want to ask this question to Val in particular. What about the kid who's resistant? The kid, I get this all the time. The kid goes, "I got this, mom. I got this. I don't need help." And I think it's
mhm.
embarrassment and fear
Mhm.
and that kind of thing that's
Mhm.
that's kicking in. But like, what how do those parents get their kids to an executive functioning coach? And then if the kid is really super snarky, how do you work with that kid? I just asked you a really hard question. I'm
Oh
sorry.
gosh. Um, well, I'm laughing ruefully, I guess, because well, we're all parents, right? I can acknowledge that I have a teenage son, and this is something we deal with a lot at home. And there is resistance. I think I have to remember that some of this is just part of normal adolescence, and that he's trying to become more of his own person, and so some of that pushback
Mhm.
is natural. And from talking with other parents, friends, I've found out I'm not the only cringy one. Everyone is
Exactly.
cringy. Anything we do is
Exactly.
cringy. Breathing is cringy. But I think, one thing that I have said to students is like, what they'll admit is that there's less fighting at home when they can go
Oh.
and they can work with someone else. So it can help cut
Mm.
down on conflict. And then assuming the parent can have sort of separate conversations with a teacher or an EF coach, if the parent is sort of doing some gentle supporting at home, that can be, the student can be more receptive to that than if the parent is saying, this is the way
Mhm.
that it has to be. These are my rules. I think there has to
Mm.
be a little bit of
Right.
flexibility there, so that the parent could maybe encourage or support what the coach or teacher is saying, but rather than just saying
Yeah.
this is the way it is. Um,
Mm.
so I think that it can help with cutting
Mhm.
down conflict at home. This may sound silly, but I find that when I'm trying to support my son, I try to model behavior that I know is actually going to be helping me. So it's like killing two birds. So for me, it's the Pomodoro technique. I stress, I panic if I look at a task like, oh my God, this is interminable. I'm going to be here for 5 hours. But if I can set a
Mm.
25-minute timer, I've got a manageable chunk. I know it's going to end, and I can have my 5 minute, coffee break or whatever after. But I look at the time ticking down and I think, okay, I can do this. I can accomplish these two or three
Mm.
things. So maybe it sounds a little selfish, but I kind of find that I benefit from going through this process with my son by trying
Mm.
techniques out that I want him to try and seeing what actually works for me or
Me
doesn't.
too.
I love that. And I'm thinking also I love that. And I'm thinking also about the we idea, Val. Wonder what you both think about this. Like what if we
Yeah.
presented to, let's say we have a resistant kid for
Mhm.
executive functioning, and we say something like, you know, things have been difficult between us. We've been arguing, and I really don't want to have that kind of relationship. So I'm thinking that we might both need a little bit of
Mm.
support.
Mm.
Like, I'm going to get some support from the executive functioning coach. So I say this to my
Mhm.
daughter, so I can get off your back and you can get the support so that we don't have to fight. Like, what if the goal was
Yeah.
actually the relationship? Julie and I talk about this a lot instead of the
I
like getting
like
better
Ooh.
that a
grades.
lot. I like that a lot. Yeah, Elizabeth, you and I have spoken about that, a number of times, which is when we put the relationship at the heart of everything, it allows us to do the kind of acceptance that I was talking about before. Be curious, lean in with curiosity, and really say, how can I support you? How can I support you? I'm not saying you have to do this, whatever it is, but I want to be your teammate, and I don't want to argue with you anymore. That isn't good. I also find
Mhm.
that using the word coach is really helpful, as
Hmm.
opposed to, and this is for getting kids to go to see therapists as well. Don't call it a therapist. This is someone who's going to coach you
Mm.
on, keeping your
Mm.
feelings together, or, obviously coach is part of executive functioning coach. So you're kind of already ahead of the game, Val, with that. But I think that it's important to name it something that kids can relate to. Most kids play a sport,
Mm.
right? And they
Mm.
have a coach in the sport. And so they're familiar with coaches. They're familiar
Hmm.
with it. There's no stigma to a coach. You have to have a coach, right? So if you can kind of
Hmm.
frame it in that regard too, I think it can be helpful.
I think so too. I just want to say, I think the reason that it's so important to focus on the relationship is because we are social beings. Even the most challenging teenager wants to be seen and heard and
Yes.
connected with. So if you speak to that relationship, maybe not the first time, maybe not the second time, but you're
Yeah,
speaking to a part of them that
that's all
that's
they
all
want.
they really want. So I just want to say to parents, like, please don't give up. Please
Exactly.
don't give up on that. And that's what Val, I think, and her tutors and her coaches, I should say, and that's another good distinction, not to say tutor, to say coach,
Mm,
really bring. I mean, I know one of them who has a very deep connection with my children,
Mm,
and it's a relationship. They trust their coach to know them,
yes.
to see them, and to work with them. And so it is really about that
Yeah.
relationship too, right?
I think with the guiding principle, what we always tell our students is there's no shame in asking any single question at all, whether it's something you feel you should have learned in third grade but is still fuzzy, or you get
Mm,
frustrated with something. I struggle with perfectionism. What is it called? Perfectionistic procrastination. That's me. That's my big, that's my Achilles heel. And my sister has been teaching me to say, done is better than perfect. And that's,
Yes,
I
that's a
say that to
great
myself 10
saying.
times, 10 times a day. It
mhm.
really helps me out a lot. But, I do want to go back to what both of you were saying about the relationship. There's this idea that, like, at the end of your life, when you reflect back on it, are you thinking about the homework assignments, the amount of money you made, or is it about the time that you spent with family and friends and the
Mhm.
relationships that you developed? And I think that really is the key to all of this, whether it's with a student and building, trust and connection and allowing them to take in support, and then start to, execute it on their own, so they have more
Mm.
agency. Relationship with family, we're going through, all the stages of adolescence and resistance, which manifest in many ways. But when I got an unsolicited hug last week, I could have cried.
It's
It felt
amazing.
so good. And I know I may not, get one of those for another 2 or 3 months, so I'm trying to value value those little
Right.
moments, but they mean a lot as he's, becoming more and more of an individual. I still know
Mhm.
that deep down, I think he really appreciates the support from a parent or a mentor, but someone who really sees them and
Yeah.
honors them for who they are.
Yeah, and I think it's important. Another thing we could say for resistant kids is that since their peer relationships are so important, that if you get some of this coaching, you won't spend so much time trying to figure out where your stuff is in your backpack. You can go hang out with your friends. Like I always try to find a reward
Yes.
for them in it. It would make their
Yeah,
life
for
easier,
sure.
right?
I'm curious, Val, do you have a story maybe that you could share about a kid that came in and was really successful with this executive functioning process in a way? I'm sure you probably have many stories, but in a way that gives you hope that you could just kind of impart to the parents who are listening?
Sure, and this may sound simple to us, but for a student it might not be. But I've been working with a student now for about 3 years, and we've been working on organizational skills, some the concrete tasks, looking at, a schedule, budgeting time. Budgeting time is always very difficult. Frequently, think kids think I can bang that out in 30 minutes, but it really might be more like an hour and a half is more realistic. But specifically, we've been focused on organization when it comes to writing, outlining. That's a biggie that we see with a lot of our kids. And after about 3 years of encouraging this student to try simple outlining techniques for a paper or a letter, an email to a teacher, by using bullet points and thinking of that as the real work, and then the
Mhm.
writing is easy afterward. You're just stringing it all together. After about 3 years, she finally said to me, "You know what, Val, I think these bullets might be a good idea." And I had to mask my shock, but she's doing, all of this pre-work by mapping out her thoughts, or if it's a research paper, you pop in your notes and your quotes, notes and quotes in the appropriate places, and then the writing task, I think itself becomes much easier to manage because you've got everything in place. And now she's doing that on her own. Her writing is so much clearer and organized, and her teachers have even commented on just like how much more sophisticated and in depth her writing
Wow.
has become. So that was a huge
Hmm.
accomplishment. Also, thinking of another student that my colleague has worked with, but after a long time of asking him, how would you prioritize this? How would you schedule this? How would you approach this? It's
Mhm.
begun to seep in, and he is now asking himself these questions without even realizing it. So he's been taking more ownership, and now that he's entering high school, what a great time to be cementing,
Yes.
those skills, right? You want to start advocating for yourself more. So I think it may not be, an instant success story. A lot of it's gradual, but the point is that once they start to realize it, then they can implement it themselves, and it
I
becomes
love
their own.
that. Yeah. I think
Me
it's so
too.
important that kids have ownership around all of this and accountability, because then the progress they make goes straight into the building of their self-esteem. They feel better because
Mm.
it's them. They figured it out. I love Valva's story about 3 years later, the kid coming to you and saying, "Hey, you know what? I think those bullet points would help." Because what parent hasn't had that as an example? Telling our children
I
to
know.
do something over
Yeah.
and over and over again, and then 3 years later, they claim it as their own. And and it's like, "Okay,
Yes. Yes.
never mind the 10,000 times I told you that in the past 3 years."
and And you know what's cool? The bullet points that are actually the little check boxes, because then they get the satisfaction of literally clicking that and it
Yes.
crosses out that line. So it's like, oh, I'm chipping away at this one little
Yes.
strikeout line at a time. So my kids actually really enjoy that when they're writing. Oh, I use
Mm.
this piece of evidence.
Oh, it's
Click it. It's done.
great.
But it's just
Mm.
like a little
I
marks of progress.
Yeah, and power and internal power. I mean, I think that we have to acknowledge those we can remember what it was like to be a teenager. I mean, as parents, we see teenagers as, sometimes defiant and difficult and resistant, but it is a
Yeah.
difficult time emotionally. As Julie brought up, self-esteem. So to be able to
Mhm.
have wins like that is so important. And I always think it's not even the content. This is what I think is so beautiful about your work, Val, is that it's not even the content as much as it is
Right.
about the process. You're
Mm-hmm.
teaching these kids processes to get through hard experiences. Their hard experience happens to be history, but in 10 years, it's going to be a difficult roommate or a challenging
Mm-hmm.
boss or getting laid off. And so it's, how do I move through the world? And I think you're giving people and these kids tools that they really need. And I think we all really need them.
Yeah. Val, you said something about the Pomodoro method. Did you say that? I don't know what that is,
Oh,
actually.
yes. Yeah. Oh, sure. So I think the idea comes from a Pomodoro tomato, like a kitchen timer shaped like a tomato. But the Pomodoro method basically means setting your timer for 25 minutes. And so you can just do like maybe one task or two tasks. But the idea is, that the timer is eventually going to go off, and actually sooner than you think. And then you set it for 5 minutes and you take a break. You put that task aside, you get up, like I said, you grab a coffee, I don't know, just do a quick chore, and then you can set it for
Got it.
another 25 minutes. But the idea is basically to do manageable chunks of time. I just see so many times with our students, especially my son, you sit at the desk, you undo the bag, you look at everything, and it feels overwhelming, especially if you think of, I have 5 assignments and I need to do them all back to back.
Yeah.
Whereas if you can do these smart, like manageable Pomodoro chunks, I think it just makes it much easier to approach.
You mentioned something important earlier that I think as parents that we might not be aware of. I know when I was a kid and we had handwritten planners, the teachers would have to write it on the board and say, okay, everybody, take out your planner and write this down. And so that was like the first encoding of it, right? Then the second
Mm,
encoding was writing it. And then maybe the third was reading it when I got home. Now teachers
Yeah.
say, check Google Classroom. And so I think it's just important for parents to know that they're not, the first time they might see that homework is when they're sitting at the desk and they see all the homework. So that is very overwhelming. And you can't ask. I mean, I remember going after class and saying, like, wait, I'm not exactly sure. Do you mean page 30 up until 35 or including 35? But they can't do that. And I think it's so important for parents to understand the extra load that these kids
I
have
think that's
now with this
so
technology.
smart, because I hear all the time the parents don't understand Google Classroom. So how can the kids possibly understand Google
Mm.
Classroom? And I've never been on it because it's after my children's time, um, but apparently, like, you have to go to different places. You have to navigate the classroom. It's not like
Oh,
it's
yeah.
all, condensed into one page, right?
No. Unfortunately, it's on like 3 pages. It's actually a million, like, you get an email and it's on a list, and also which of these kids have checked
No.
their email? I mean, I don't
Mhm.
even they don't even check. So it's really hard to find, and then you see it in 2 places, and then if the teacher I get it. If I was a teacher, think about when you try to do the subject lines for your email. Like, imagine having to do subject lines for the lessons, right? Like, lesson 4.2, lesson 6.8. I mean, you don't have to have an organizational
Right.
problem for this to be hard. It's really challenging, right, Val?
Mhm.
I mean, that's a huge piece of it.
Oh, absolutely. I have a student who has a teacher who teaches a course, a history class involves a lot of information. So, not just like articles to read, but separate documents about how to cite information from those articles. And that might link to something about
Yes.
an MLA citation. It's like an onion, it might be 7 layers deep, that you
Yes.
have to navigate to get all the information that you need. I mean, I just think of how cluttered my mind can feel. I can imagine how just exhausting it is for them to see this information and think, well, where do I find the most salient information that I need to get this task done? So it makes sense that kids can be, completely overwhelmed. I mean, one thing that I'll just say as a parent that I struggle with is over involvement, and I don't know if you two feel that
Mm.
way. Excuse me, with your kids, because you're experts in these fields we're talking about. But I tend to look at Google Classroom anticipating that my son might find it overwhelming. And so then I look at, well, what are the assignments? When are they due? Da, da, da. And then I might hop on Jupiter to check his grades or jump rope. So I tend to get over involved, and then there's going to be some
Yeah.
natural conflict. So one thing that I have to remember, and I talk to our parents about, is trying to pull back like in stages. So rather than checking
Mm.
every night, maybe pull back to
Mhm.
every other night. And then maybe my goal is in these later high school years is just maybe on Sunday night before the week starts, how does your bag look? How's your backpack? Does it have an old sandwich in it, or is it pretty organized? And then what do you have coming up this week that's big? And why don't we just, check your grades maybe
Right.
every 2 weeks? And if there's something that's a little off, well, what happened? Have you thought about what you might do differently this time? But that's something I have to tell myself a lot, is to really dial it
Mhm.
dial it
Mhm.
down.
I think that's a good strategy of
Yeah.
doing it slowly. Um, I had to do that too, but I saw that it was my relationship or Google
Mm,
Classroom. And I took a huge step back, and I just trusted that if my daughter didn't pass, that was what was meant to be. Like, I just
mm,
had to step back for the sake of our relationship, and she really flourished, and we are closer, than we were. And she even said to me, she has a rule that we don't talk about. I've shared on the podcast before. She says we don't talk about school at the dinner table. And she'll correct me when I start talking about it. And she'll say, "Remember, we don't talk about school." So she's like, the question you asked earlier of like what works for you, if you were to ask
mm.
me as a parent, like, what was working with your daughter, checking was not working. So why would I keep doing it? Like, I mean, it was very hard. I had a lot of support, including Julie. I did not do it alone. It is not an alone job, but it's hard. But I'm so glad you brought that up for parents. I think Julie and I work all the time and our own experience of with
For
parents who are
sure.
very
For
involved,
sure.
right, Julie?
Micromanagement, tiger mom, none of that works well.
Mhm.
You may get
Mm-mm.
some immediate results, but in the decline of the relationship that goes along with that, you wind up with kind of a negative sum. And at some point, the child
Yeah.
backs off and says, I'm not doing this anymore. And then you've got no relationship. So you have no influence, and they refusing to do the work. So it's so hard, though, I think, for parents to, it's so hard for parents to not project themselves onto their child and to see their child's strengths and weaknesses and successes and failures as their own. I mean, that parents often, my kid's going to be the basketball star because that's what dad or mom wanted,
Mm.
growing up, to be the basketball star. Meanwhile, the kid's 5 feet tall. The kid's not going to be a basketball star. And, kind of letting go of some of that, I think, is so important. It's so hard. It
So
it
hard.
really, really
Yeah.
is. Without doing the inner work that we need to do as parents, which we've talked about in a previous podcast around eating and looking at our own relationship with food in terms of how that informs feeding our children appropriately and not creating the eating disorders. I just think it's really, I think it's hard for parents.
I think it's really hard for parents. I agree. And I think that Julie and I have an advantage than that we have seen how it doesn't work
Yes.
because of our profession. So it's not that we're some like extra brave women who can
Right.
do
Mhm.
this and other people can't. We just see we have the gift of seeing what happens if you keep doing it because of our
No,
clients.
I
I think I'm
completely
speaking
agree.
for you, Julie, but I think you would agree. Right. And so and I think that Julie is exactly right about needing to do that inner work. And you mentioned something earlier too, Julie, about the fear. Like there's so much fear about what is going to happen to my kid if they, I don't know, have to repeat senior year or take a
Mhm.
gap year
Yeah.
Mhm.
or, you know, the dreaded, I'm going to say this, but it's not dreaded. I'm being, like community
So
call, like,
what?
okay, like whatever that people have different paths, and I think that the more we just need to keep checking ourselves and asking ourselves, and we talked about this in the podcast, like what are the facts of now and
Mhm.
what am I afraid of, and is that
Exactly.
happening right here? And I think that it's the hardest thing to do, but it is the most rewarding. And people will say to me, God, I can't believe you were able to do that. And I say, honestly, it was so instantly rewarding. It didn't think about it after the first
Right.
time I stopped nagging her because our relationships was so, that's the thing. And like what Julie said, the being on top of them and micromanaging, that is a
Mhm.
very brief, short, maybe one assignment, but then the next assignment they don't hand in. This other piece of letting go and focusing on the relationship is so quickly
Yeah.
reinforcing.
Yeah, and I think, there's so much value in letting your child sink in order to learn to swim.
Hmm.
And I mean, I know parents, you're talking, Elizabeth, you're talking about, well, what if they go to community college for a year? I deal with parents who are worried because their child's going to get a B in a class, a B plus in a class.
Oh
That's
gosh.
the worry,
Mhm.
right? They won't get to go to good college. They're not going to have the choices that they need. And I'm like, well, you know, what other grades is the child making? Straight A's. I'm like, are you kidding me?
Right.
You know, let it go. Um, and that's where I think the
Mhm.
inner work comes in, having to really look
Yeah.
at, where did we fail ourselves in growing up? How have we rectified
Hmm.
that or not made peace with it or whatever that might be in order to get,
Mhm.
in order to give our children the room to grow.
And the good news is we're going to be talking about that in a future podcast to help people. So if you're intrigued, keep listening. And I think the other thing that I say a lot on this podcast, Julie and Val, is that I think that I have a lot of compassion for parents. See,
Oh,
Julie and I
yes.
have this opportunity of seeing ahead. We're really supposed to be living communally. So we're supposed to have an auntie like
Or an
Julie or me
uncle
or someone
or
who's
yeah.
already been through it and says, "Oh," or an uncle, right? Or a person like you've done that. Like my kid, they totally fell off the path and then they came back. We're supposed to have that kind of support and we don't in our culture. I mean, at least in Western culture, there are cultures that have that. And so we don't have that opportunity to learn from others that
Right.
this too shall pass. And this is not the worst thing that'll
Exactly.
ever
And
happen.
I think that's one of the very valuable things about the work that you do, Val, is you provide that, you're like the auntie who comes in and is
Mm.
not, it's the relationship, because it's not parent and child, isn't fraught as it can be between,
Mm-hmm.
between parent and child. And so you're able to really guide in a way that parents don't, first of all, don't have the knowledge to be able to guide a lot of the time, and second of all, our job as parents is to just be parents as opposed to tutors or coaches or whatever. um, I think we've covered so much great ground today, and we may have to have you back, Val, because I don't feel like we even hit the tip of the iceberg. But if I could ask you maybe if you could name one thing that you'd like for our listeners to be left with. And I know it's really hard to ask for one thing. So if you need to make it two, that's okay. But like, what would you say to parents to encourage them?
I think I would encourage them to maybe try to put themselves in their kids' shoes, and just remember that in today's world, things can seem, I think, a lot more overwhelming than they did perhaps when we were kids. You know, we've been talking a lot about technology, for example, today, about just the ubiquity of technology, and you
Hmm.
can't escape it. And we didn't really have we weren't really overwhelmed by all of that. I think you were saying earlier, Julie, like we would go into the classroom, the teacher would give us
Yeah.
the plan, we would write it down. Elizabeth, you were also talking about that. We had a system, and now it's just overwhelming, all of the options. I mean, I also grew up with 3 channels, and then Fox
Yes.
was introduced on TV maybe when I was 10 or 12. Now you ask a friend, what are you watching? And it could be one of 200, I
Yes.
don't know, 200,000, options. It's just overwhelming. So, at least with my son and our students, I just try to put myself in their shoes and think of how
Yeah.
tough it is for them. And also, I will just say, being based in New York City, I think it's
Yeah.
exceptionally tough here because it's such a competitive environment. And I think, Elizabeth, you were saying, sort of uh, antithetical to this village idea, this
Hmm.
community idea. I think many parents might keep what they think are their child's struggles to themselves, or
Yeah.
any prep or coaching their child is getting. They may not want to tell somebody about it because it is a very competitive environment. And I think, Julia, you were saying about that B for a student might feel like, oh my
Yeah.
gosh, I am never going to get into a good college because of that one bad mark, and it's not bad at all. So I think maybe like you both, I've got an advantage just from also having worked with kids for a long time and seeing them through all of these educational stages, that it really is going to
Hmm.
be
Yes.
okay. That if it's not Cornell, it's going to be another fine school where you're pretty likely
Yeah.
going to thrive. So to just try to remember all of the pressure that they're under, and how they might seem like their worries might seem exaggerated, but they're really founded in a deep fear and concern that maybe they're
Yeah.
not measuring up to
Hmm.
their peers, or maybe to even their
Yeah.
parents standards. So that was kind of a mouthful, but I guess it just comes
I
down to
like
trying to
that.
put yourself in their shoes and think of
I
everything that they're
like that
going
so
through.
much. Well, it has been wonderful. Elizabeth and Val, it's been so great to have you both here today. And Val, thank you so much. I feel like this is really going to help our listeners. And we will put in the notes how to get a hold of you, and we'll make sure that the word gets out about specifically what you do and the people with your team. So thank you all. Yeah,
Oh,
thank you.
thanks so much, Julie. Well, and thank you, Elizabeth. I feel
Oh,
like I learned a lot from both of you, and it's very assuring to be, speaking with two, lovely, women who are nurturers, and clearly care about their work and their children, and we're just very lucky to have you on our
thank you
side.
so much, Val.
Oh, thank you.
You've been listening to the Parenting Horizons podcast. If you would like to reach Elizabeth Cohen, you can go to www.centerforcbtinnyc.com.
And if you'd like to reach Julie Ross, please go to www.parentinghorizons.com.